Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling Guyanese politics. Specifically, we're looking at the upcoming 2025 election, which is shaping up to be a pretty big showdown between the ruling People's Progressive Party, or PPP as most people know them, and the opposition coalition, which is made up of a Partnership for National Unity, that's APNU, and the Alliance for Change, or AFC. Our main source material today is a recent press conference given by Dr. Jagdeo. He's the PPP's general secretary. So this press conference is really a window into the current political landscape in Guyana. I mean, local Guyanese media covered this thing extensively, but we're going to be pulling out the most intriguing and overlooked points. Jagdeo really didn't mince words at this press conference, and he kicked things off with a pretty interesting statement. He said, it's the same old cabal doing the same old thing and hoping they can pull wool over the eyes of the people of this country. No. So what's he referring to here?
Well, it's fascinating how Jagdeo just comes out swinging right away. I mean, he's framing the opposition as completely untrustworthy. And he says they're using the same tired old tactics. And this really sets the tone for the whole press conference. And it gives us a pretty good insight into the PPP strategy heading into this election. Yeah,
it's almost like he's trying to preemptively discredit them before the campaign even really gets going. Yeah. Now, speaking of the opposition, let's talk about APNU and AFC. I mean, they've had a pretty rocky relationship, and now they're trying to reunite for this election after this very public falling out. What do you make of this reunion and Jagdeo's clear skepticism about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a marriage of convenience. Both parties realize that they have a much better chance of defeating the PPP if they can present a united front. But as Jagdeo points out, there's some serious cracks in this coalition, especially when it comes to actually choosing a presidential candidate. Jagdeo even draws a parallel to the Cummingsburg Accord, which was a previous agreement between these two parties. And Jagdeo is saying that the APNU didn't honor that agreement. So he's basically saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice.
Right.
The rest.
There's a real history here and a lack of trust that's going to be pretty hard to ignore. Now, Jagdeo also claims that the AFC is trying to force its way into securing the presidential candidacy for Nigel Hughes, who just recently replaced Kamran Ramshan as the AFC leader.
Yeah.
And he's suggesting that they're using polls to show Hughes's unpopularity, and then they're using that as leverage to force the PNC, which is the main party within the APNU, to concede the candidacy to them. What do you think? Is this a genuine concern, or is Jagdeo just trying to, stir the pot and create problems?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, there's definitely a power struggle going on within the coalition. And the AFC, even though they're the smaller partner, they're willing to play hardball to get what they want. But Jagdeo also benefits from making the opposition look divided and chaotic, because it makes the PPP look more stable and reliable by comparison.
Right. Makes them look like the adults in the room.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this coalition drama brewing, but the opposition is also hitting back, particularly on the issue of election transparency. And they're campaigning for the use of biometrics, specifically fingerprints, as a way to make sure that the election is fair. This seems like a reasonable demand on the surface. So why is Jagdeo pushing back so hard against it?
Well, Jagdeo is arguing that fingerprints are already being collected and digitized in Guyana. So his point is that the technology itself isn't the issue. It's how the opposition wants to use it. He's claiming that they're going to try to create a situation where people end up being disenfranchised, maybe through confusion at the polling stations, or by making biometrics a requirement that some people just can't meet.
He even brings up the 1997 election, when the use of ID cards to vote was initially agreed on, but then it was later challenged as unconstitutional after the PPP lost, and that led to new elections. It sounds like he's suggesting that the opposition is trying to pull a similar stunt this time around.
Yeah, that's a very clever tactic. He's tapping into people's fears about electoral manipulation. And then he's framing the opposition as the ones who are actually trying to undermine democracy. Now, whether there's any truth to the accusation is another matter, but it certainly plants a seed of doubt in voters' minds. And for you, the listener, this raises a really important question. How do you balance the need for security and accuracy in elections with the possibility that those measures could be used to disenfranchise voters? It's a very delicate balance.
Absolutely. And it's still something to keep in mind as we follow these developments in Guyana. Now, Jagdeo doesn't just focus on political maneuvering in this press conference. He also goes after the opposition's economic policies.
Right.
And he spends a lot of time criticizing their proposals and contrasting them with the PPP approach.
Yeah. He really focuses on their critique of the 2025 budget.
Yeah. He accuses them of making all these unrealistic promises and basically trying to share out what we don't have. And he uses the APNU AFC promise of monthly cash grants and benefits exceeding GY $300,000 per household as like a prime example of that.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of money. I mean, it's almost GY $1 trillion annually, which Jagdeo points out is more than double the projected oil revenue. And it's even more than the country's total revenue. He's trying to make the opposition look totally irresponsible and out of touch with economic realities.
Right. And then he contrasts that with the PPP budget, which allocates 37% of oil revenue to sectors like healthcare and education and housing. He's trying to portray the PPP as the party of responsible economic management, investing in long-term growth rather than just short-term handouts. He even throws in this little dig at a chart that Aubrey Norton, the leader of the opposition, shared on social media. Jagdeo just dismisses it as basic economics and a clung show, which I have to admit I chuckled at. I guess politicians everywhere love to throw shade. But beyond all the political theater, what's the real takeaway here for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that there are some very different visions at play here. The opposition is advocating for a more direct and immediate distribution of the oil wealth to the people, while the PPP is taking a more cautious approach, emphasizing investment in infrastructure and long-term development. And both approaches have their pros and cons. And ultimately, it's up to the Guyanese people to decide which vision they believe in.
And that decision is going to be heavily influenced by how these issues play out in the upcoming election campaign.
Exactly. The economy is going to be a major battleground, and both sides are going to be trying to convince voters that they have the best plan for Guyana's future.
It's really fascinating to see how Jagdeo is trying to control the narrative, even before the campaign officially kicks off. But the opposition isn't just going to sit back and let him dictate the terms of the debate. They're going to come out swinging, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a very, very heated election.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot at stake here, and neither side is going to back down easily. This is going to be a political showdown for the ages, and for our listeners, keep in mind that understanding the economic arguments being made by both sides is going to be absolutely crucial for evaluating their platforms and making an informed decision when it comes time to vote.
It's going to be interesting to watch it all unfold, but that's going to have to wait for the next part of our deep dive. So make sure to come back for part 2, where we're going to be diving deeper into some of the other key issues that came up in this press conference. We'll see you then.
Okay, so it's clear that economic issues are going to be, front and center in this election. But Jagdeo also spends a lot of time defending the PPP's record. What really stood out to you there?
Well, he really emphasizes those tax relief measures that the PPP has introduced. He talks about increasing the tax-free threshold, lowering tax rates, and things like providing tax benefits for overtime pay and second jobs. He's trying to show that the PPP is the party that's actually putting more money in people's pockets. And he contrasts that with the previous APNU-AFC government, saying that they actually increased taxes on essential goods and services and raised the highest tax rate from 30% to 40%. So he's really trying to paint this stark contrast between the two parties, right? He's trying to make the PPP look like the champions of the working class and the APNU-AFC as this out-of-touch elite. But how much of this is just political spin and how much is actually based in reality?
Yeah, it's always tricky to disentangle the political rhetoric from the actual economic outcomes. But it's definitely true that the PPP has implemented some policies that have provided relief to some segments of the population. The question is, are those benefits being felt broadly? And are they outweighing the rising cost of living that a lot of Guyanese are facing?
Right. Now, Jagdeo also pushes back against the opposition's claim that the GY $9 billion that's allocated for cost of living interventions is inadequate. He argues that that figure doesn't include the $90 billion saved by maintaining zero excise tax on gasoline and diesel and the electricity subsidies and other measures. He's trying to say, look, we're doing a lot to help people, even if you don't see it right away. But do you think that argument is going to resonate with voters who are still struggling to make ends meet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? For a lot of people, the economic realities on the ground are going to be way more persuasive than any statistics or political arguments. If they're still feeling the pinch, if they're not seeing tangible improvements in their lives, then those cost of living interventions that Jagdeo is talking about just might not be enough to win their support.
So we've talked about the economic debate, but there's another accusation that comes up in this press conference that I thought was really interesting. The opposition is accusing the PPP government of favoring their friends and family in the distribution of resources. I mean, this is a pretty classic political attack. But Jagdeo's response is pretty surprising. He essentially says, well, you did it too.
Right. He doesn't really deny the accusations outright. Instead, he kind of turns the tables and points out instances where members of the opposition allegedly benefited from similar practices when they were in power. He brings up Nigel Hughes' involvement in constitutional reform and alleged contracts awarded to Hughes' wife. It's kind of a classic two wrongs don't make a right situation, but in politics it often just becomes a game of who did it worse.
Yeah, it's all about whataboutism. Now he goes even further and tries to actually redefine what friends and family means for the PPP. He claims that it's actually the thousands of people who benefit from their policies, things like scholarships and housing programs and government contracts. He's trying to turn a potentially damaging accusation into a positive by saying that the PPP is really just looking out for the ordinary people. But do you think that that's going to fly with voters who are probably skeptical of both parties at this point?
I think it really depends on the voter. For some people, this kind of whataboutism might be enough to deflect the criticism. They might think, well, if both sides are guilty, then maybe it's not that big of a deal. But for others, this kind of response is just going to confirm their cynicism about the whole political system. They're going to think, oh, they're all corrupt, they're all looking out for themselves, nothing is ever going to change.
And that cynicism is a real problem. It undermines trust in democracy and makes it harder to actually address these issues in a meaningful way. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about another issue that came up in this press conference, the gas to energy project. The opposition has been pretty critical of this project, questioning its feasibility and the due diligence that's been done. But Jagdeo seems almost offended by these critiques.
Yeah, he just dismisses the need for a feasibility study. He calls it unnecessary and a charade, saying that the project's benefits are self-evident. He even accuses the media of amplifying the opposition's concerns, like they're just stirring the pot for no reason.
His defensiveness is really striking. It's almost like he's trying to just shut down any debate or discussion about the project. What do you make of that?
I think it speaks to this broader pattern in the PPP's approach to governing. They have a very assertive, some might even say authoritarian style. They see themselves as the stewards of Guyana's future, and they're not afraid to push back against anyone who questions their vision.
And that includes the media, which Jagdeo seems to view as an obstacle rather than a necessary component of a functioning democracy.
Exactly. And his dismissive attitude towards these, legitimate questions from journalists is concerning. A free and independent press is crucial for holding those in power accountable. And Jagdeo's attempts to discredit and silence critical voices is really troubling.
It raises serious questions about freedom of the press in Guyana and whether journalists are really able to do their jobs effectively. If reporters are afraid to ask tough questions or challenge the government's narrative, then democracy itself is at risk.
Yeah.
For our listeners, this raises a really important point. How do you evaluate the information that you're getting about this project? Do you trust the government's assurances? Or do you think it's important to hear from independent voices, including those who might be critical of the project? This is where media literacy becomes so crucial.
Absolutely. It's about being able to critically assess the information that you're consuming. Consider different perspectives and form your own informed opinions. And that's especially important in a context like this where the government is actively trying to control the narrative.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the economic debate, the friends and family accusations, and the controversy surrounding the gas to energy project. What's the overall takeaway for our listeners? What are the key things to keep in mind as we head into this election?
I think there are a few key things to watch for. First, how does that APNU-AFC coalition hold up under pressure? Can they overcome their internal divisions and present a united front to voters? Second, watch how this economic debate unfolds. Will the PPP's emphasis on tax cuts and long-term development resonate with voters who are struggling with the cost of living? Or will the opposition's calls for a more equitable distribution of oil wealth gain traction? And finally, keep an eye on how the media covers the campaign. Will they be able to report freely and fairly, or will they face intimidation and pressure from the government?
So it really feels like we're seeing these two very different visions for Guyana's future clashing in this election. On the one hand, you've got the PPP pushing for this rapid economic development driven by oil revenue. They're taking this full steam ahead approach, and they're getting pretty impatient with anyone who dares to question their strategy.
And on the other hand, you have the opposition. They're raising some important concerns about things like transparency in government and holding those in power accountable, making sure that all this newfound wealth benefits all Guyanese, not just a select few at the top. But as we talked about earlier, the opposition's own history isn't exactly spotless, which makes it really hard for them to try to build trust with voters. It's like they're trying to convince people that they've changed, but that past is always going to be looming over them.
Yeah, it's tough to shake that. And then you've got the media kind of caught in the middle of all this.
Yeah.
Jagdeo's disdain for any kind of scrutiny from the press, and his tendency to just brush off any valid questions as, just part of some opposition scheme.
It definitely raises some questions about how much freedom the press really has in Guyana, and whether journalists are actually able to do their jobs properly. If reporters are afraid to ask the tough questions or push back against the government's narrative, then it really undermines the whole idea of a free press, which is essential for any democracy.
So with all of this going on, where does this leave the Guyanese people? I mean, how do they make sense of this whole political landscape and actually make informed choices about their future? It seems pretty overwhelming.
It really comes down to being a critical consumer of information. Don't just accept what you hear from politicians or the media at face value. Dig a little deeper, look for evidence. Try to understand all the different perspectives that are out there, and don't be shy about asking questions.
So it's not just about listening passively. It's about actively engaging with the information and demanding more from our leaders. We need to hold them accountable for what they're promising and push for a system that's truly transparent and fair.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that, the future of Guyana isn't set in stone. It's being shaped right now by the decisions that are being made, by the choices of its citizens, and how they participate in the whole political process.
So for everyone listening, as you learn more about Guyanese politics, remember this. Be informed, be engaged, and speak up for the kind of future that you want to see for your country. Your voice matters.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about oil wealth or who wins this political game. It's about the well-being of the Guyanese people, the strength of their communities, and creating a better future for all Guyanese.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.